Here at the Tank Museum, we are incredibly fortunate. We have the last surviving example of a British Mark I tank. And in this video, what I'd like to do is talk in some detail about this old lady, and also the action fought by C and D companies, the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps, on the 15th of September 1916. This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members and our Super Thanks donors. Please join them if you can and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching. Keep watching to the end of this video to find out how you can purchase a copy of The Tanks at Flers, the most comprehensive account of the first tank action, and available exclusively from the Tank Museum. As most of you will know, the tank is a product of trench warfare on the Western Front, and the huge casualties caused by machine gun and artillery fire and barbed wire in colossal quantities. The call goes out for a machine gun destroyer. But the problem is, nobody's built anything like this before. The requirements were for a machine that could suppress enemy strong points and fire positions, be able to cross a 3-metre wide gap, a typical German trench in short, cope sufficiently with the appalling ground conditions, and flatten barbed wire entanglements to let the infantry follow through. After a number of false starts, Foster & Co. in Lincoln came up with a prototype design in August 1915, and this became nicknamed Little Willie. If you want to know more about Little Willie, see the link below. Suffice it to say, the thing never saw a battlefield. It fell down on the second requirement. The machine could not cross trenches. Little Willie did act as a test bed for two useful elements: the power unit, a British Daimler straight 6 petrol engine, and an effective set of tracks, these being designed by Foster's managing director, William Tritton. But it took a slightly irascible but brilliant engineer, Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, to solve the major problem. Wilson redesigned the vehicle, changing the shape to the familiar rhomboid forever associated with British World War I tanks, and still featured on the cap badge of the Royal Tank Regiment. With the changed design, the tracks now stuck out at the front and the back, the front and rear horns. And this meant that with a bit of skill and luck, the vehicle could just about cross the critical 3-metre gap. The first tank built to this design was completed in January 1916 and nicknamed Mother. With a few adjustments, this became the design of the first production tank, the Mark I. The name tank seems to have come about as a bit of a subterfuge to disguise the actual purpose of the big metal object that Fosters were building. It was put about they were water tanks destined for Russia. Anyway, let's see the characteristics that mark her out as a Mark I. The first thing to say is we don't know anything much about the history of this actual tank. In January and February 1916, trials of Mother were held at Hatfield Park, north of London. And after the war, our Mark I was presented to the landowner, the Marquess of Salisbury, probably in recompense for the destruction of his golf course, which had been turned into a trench system to demonstrate the tank. The Hatfield tank spent several decades outside before being donated to this museum in 1970. And partly as a result of this, he's not in a great state internally, as you'll see in a moment. Firstly though, the outside. The tank is painted to resemble C-19, Clan Leslie, which saw action at Flers, and it does give a very good and dramatic impression of the first tank attack, looming above an enemy trench and its terrified defenders. The tank, at least in its present configuration, is a male, so its primary armament are twin Hotchkiss 6-pounder QF guns, and it's got Hotchkiss machine guns as secondary armament. The 6-pounders were originally a naval design, and the barrels were, in practice, too long for tank use, fouling the ground as the vehicle moved and risking them being damaged. The solution was to use guns with barrels shorter by 39 inches, and that didn't affect accuracy much at the ranges these were being used, and those shorter barrel guns were used on later Marks. The guns on this tank are not original to this vehicle. because they are the shorter type, but they've been cosmetically extended. They've got wooden extensions on the end of the barrels. Looking at the upper part of the sponson, you can see 2 covered ports for the Hotchkiss machine guns, and right at the top, the cleats for lifting the sponson off the tank. This had to be done for transport by rail, otherwise the tanks would be too wide. Taking the sponsons off is a horrible, dangerous job. Once you've detached them, they're unstable, and each one weighs about 2 tons. A sponson trailer was designed to ease the problem of moving the sponsons around, and we have one here in our collection. Very rare survivor. Looking at the gun mount, it's different to the Mark IV, which has a much more solid mount bolted onto the sponson floor, rather than this shell storage. Presumably the design was not strong enough. At the back of the sponson is the door, and there's a gap at the bottom for the disposal of spent brass shell cases. At Flers, a crewman was actually bayoneted by a German soldier through that gap. Now, as I mentioned, this is a male tank. Now, the difference is the armament. The males are armed with twin 6-pounder guns, the females with .303-inch Vickers guns, 2 to each sponson. We don't have a Mark I female, but we do have a Mark II, which has almost identical sponsons. The Vickers guns themselves are protected by armoured jackets and rotate with their circular shields. Unlike on the male tank, they can fire to the rear of the vehicle. The main drawback with this type of sponson, certainly to my way of thinking, is the door. It's down here at the bottom of the sponson. It's really small. It's only about 2 feet high. Imagine trying to bail out of a burning tank through that. Coming around to the back of the tank, we're going to look at the feature that most people associate with the British Mark I, and that is this wheeled tail assembly. Now, this has 2 purposes. The first one, the minor purpose, is all about steering, because each of these wheels turns on a stub axle, and the driver can actually use that, the steering wheel up at the front, in order to aid the tank's turning capability. But the main reason for it is it alters the centre of gravity of the tank. And we've got a series of springs and a hydraulic piston. Now, if you're approaching a slope, what you do is use the piston, and that raises the wheels up in the air. That diminishes the weight at the front of the tank and makes it easier to get up a slope. Going down slope, the springs keep the wheels in contact with the ground, and that does the reverse thing. It means there's more weight at the front of the tank, so you get more control. Finally, on top of the tank is a reconstructed wood and chicken wire screen. This was mainly a C Company thing, and it was meant to stop grenades being thrown on top. It wasn't very effective, and it doesn't appear much after Flers. So this is the interior of the last surviving British Mark I tank, and I can tell you it feels like quite a privilege to be here inside, effectively the first of the first. As I mentioned, the tank was outside in Hatfield Park for some decades, and like any gate guard vehicle, there's quite a lot of corrosion, water gets in. It's also been stripped out to a limited extent, but you can still see the basic features of the tank. So either side, you have the sponsons for the 6-pounder guns, and then obviously in the middle, that is the engine block. That is the British Daimler straight 6 petrol engine. And that causes huge problems for the crew, because of course, it's right in the middle. It fills the air with fumes, it sprays oil in all directions, it leaks carbon monoxide gas. So the interior of this vehicle, when it's running in combat, the temperature is about 50 degrees centigrade, the air is full of carbon monoxide, it's full of cordite smoke from firing the guns. It's absolutely unbearable. Some of the things that are missing, the exhausts have disappeared. There is the handle for the differential lock, which you need to actually turn the tank. The rest of it's gone. But looking at the actual crew compartment, up at the front here, you've got the commander and the driver. And there is the steering wheel. Now, we talked about the tail skid at the back. That's what the driver uses to steer the vehicle using that. It's not very effective, to be brutally honest. But there'd be, in this vehicle, 8 crew. Commander, driver, 2 gunners either side to operate the 6-pounders, and then at the back there are 2 gearsmen. Now the gearsmen, they basically do the steering. You can't, neither of these guys at the front can actually turn the tank properly. It's the gearsmen who actually effect the major turns by using the secondary gears, and the driver uses the diff lock. There's also a colossal amount of noise in here. You can't even shout at one another. So you're communicating in those VAR conditions by hand signals. 4 guys, a committee of 4, to drive one tank in some of the worst conditions in the world. We've talked about, the general conditions the crew had to put up with: the noise, the carbon monoxide, the heat, the cordite smoke. But there are others, in fact there are 2 others I'm thinking of, and they're called splash and spall. Now, coming into combat, this vehicle is going to be the target of a huge amount of small arms fire. Now, the armour, it's 6 to 10 mil, will just about keep out machine gun and rifle rounds. But what will happen is they'll impact on the armour itself, and there are a myriad of little gaps all over the place. So something like a rifle bullet will break up, and the lead core will come through, and that's molten. So you've got a fine spray of molten lead flying about the place. That is splash. Spall is slightly different. That's when a round impacts on the outside, and particularly with machine gun fire, if you've got multiple impacts in the same place, you get little bits of metal and paint flying off. So you're in this blizzard, little bits of paint, molten lead. It is not deadly, but it is extremely unpleasant. They did start to provide protective masks made of chainmail and leather in order to try and really sort of minimise the harm. But they are unpopular, they're hot, they sweat, they fall off. I think most of them wound up a bit like the leather helmets that were proposed to start off with. I think a lot of them wound up in a ditch in France, and the crews really did with that. There is one problem, though, that is unique to Mark I. Remember, these vehicles are quite experimental. The vision slits had glass prisms inserted in them. These things shatter when they're hit by small arms fire. And these caused injuries. Lieutenant Basil Henriquez, who's one of the tank commanders on that first tank attack at Flers, is badly cut in the face by fragments of flying glass. It was obviously quite memorable because he had one piece made into a ring which he presented to his wife. The problem is finally solved when they get rid of the brass and they insert silvered brass mirrors to basically give the same effect. The first tankmen, recruited for mechanical aptitude, in part through ads in magazines such as The Motorcycle, trained at Elvedon in Norfolk in conditions of secrecy, and then deployed by rail and across the Channel to the Somme sector. The Somme offensive was by now about 2 months old, and although the German army had given ground across the southern part of the 17-mile-wide front, high summer had seen the advance bogged down. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette, where the tanks would be employed for the first time, was an attempt to break through the enemy's defensive system and take the villages of Flers, Gueudecourt, Lebeuf and Morval, opening a gap for the cavalry corps to exploit in an advance towards Bapaume. 49 tanks from C and D companies were available. On paper, each company had 24 tanks, plus 1 spare, organised into 4 sections of 6. The bulk, 42, were assigned to support the 4th Army, on whose frontage the main attack was to be launched, with 1 section from C Company supporting the reserve army. A further 10 tanks, all mechanically unfit, were left behind at Reserve Army's GHQ. The tanks were to be deployed in subsections of 2 or 3 to deal with enemy strong points, and they're timed to reach their objectives 5 minutes ahead of the supporting infantry. Creeping and targeted artillery barrages are also to be brought down at 0 hour, but these are organised to leave lanes through which the tanks would advance. Overnight, on 14th, 15th September, the move is made up to start positions. 0 hour, 0600 hours, on the 15th of September 1916, the first tank attack in history began.
49 tanks, 32 reach their start points, and the rest are suffering from mechanical trouble or simply getting ditched. Tanks working in the centre, opposite Flers, achieve the greater success. 11 reach and cross the German trenches, and the unexpected appearance of these metal monsters through the morning mist caused considerable panic. The impact was so great that one German NCO famously panicked and ran, shouting about a crocodile crawling into the trench. Other German soldiers complained that the use of armoured monsters in warfare was unfair and amounts to butchery. There was a subsection of 3 tanks detailed to attack Flers in support of 41st Division. Second Lieutenant G.F. Court's D-14 became ditched. It slips into a collapsing support trench. Attempting to free it, Second Lieutenant Huffman's D9 also slid in, and the 2 locked sponsons, so they're both immobilised. But then the remaining tank, D17, Dinner Ken, commanded by Lieutenant Stuart Hasty, continues on alone down the road towards Flers. On reaching the outskirts of the village, D17 crushed a passage through the wire and stops above the trench behind it. It enfilades the trench, firing along it, and then advances into the centre of the village, destroying several machine gun positions. Infantry following the tank secured the rest of the village. This was seen by a British aircraft, and the pilot's report led to a newspaper headline. A British tank is walking down the high street of Flers, with the infantry cheering behind it. Back home, the news of the first tank attack is greeted with jubilation, and such was the demand to see an image of a tank. The Daily Mirror paid £500 to an army charity for the privilege of being the first to print one, with the headline, "Hush, hush, a tank goes galumphant into action on the Western Front." Public opinion aside, pressures on the crews of the new war-winning weapon to succeed were enormous. This has tragic consequences. Lieutenant George McPherson, commander of a C Company tank that experienced mechanical difficulties, tragically shot himself, considering that he'd failed in his duty. Of the 49 tanks deployed on September the 15th, 1916, 9 were able to push ahead of the infantry, and they did inflict considerable loss on the enemy. Further 9, although they're not in the forefront of the attack, did useful work in clearing the strong points where the enemy was still holding out. On the minus side, the tanks had demonstrated how vulnerable they were to the appalling ground conditions, and especially shell fire. Their armour couldn't stop artillery, and the fuel and ammunition on board was a fatal combination if the tank was hit. Lieutenant A.E. Arnold, commanding Dracula, attempted to assist the crew of a tank that had been hit, but the fire was raging furiously, the ammunition going off inside like squibs. In spite of the limited degree of success at Flers, the BEF's Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, professed himself impressed. Talking to Major Bertie Stern and Colonel A.E. Swinton, 2 of the prime movers of the tank project, Haig said, "Wherever the tanks advanced, we took our objectives, and where they did not advance, we failed. Go back and make as many more tanks as you can." If you'd like to find out more about the Mark I tank, the Battle of Flers, and the men that fought in it, this is the book for you. The Tank Museum is republishing this title, The Tanks at Flers, which is a definitive work on the first use of the tank in warfare. It's been out of print for years, but it's now been updated with new information and images, and it's exclusively available from the Tank Museum. It's by far the best and most thorough account of this battle you'll find, and it appropriately commemorates the officers and men of the world's first tank unit. It's available to order now at tankmuseumshop.org. There's a link in the description below. And whilst you're there, why not treat yourself to this model Mark I brick tank by Kobe. Very much hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please subscribe. And if you can, support us on Patreon.